the reason I wrote Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God begins with emails I was getting. You know, I'd written this book, which I know you know, Dale, Crazy for God.
Yep.
And everybody, seemed to like the book. It's still out there and doing well. And it generated a ton of emails saying, okay, now we understand your journey, but what on earth do you believe right now? Where are you at?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that started a train of thought in my own mind. And so, this book here, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, which I know you've read, Dale, and reviewed, just came out. And really what it is the answer to myself to the question, what do you believe, having taken this long journey out of evangelical Protestantism through the Greek Orthodox Church and into a kind of a progressive place, both politically and spiritually. And this book is my working it out on the page. Interestingly enough, I sent out to you and a bunch of other folks some free review copies. And the deal was, if you review this when it comes out on Amazon, I'll give you a free copy. And I have no idea what the response will be, except the email I've gotten back from the folks who've read it so far is good. They really like it. A lot of people feel that I've kind of mirrored somewhat of their own story. So I don't think I'm the only person who's taken this journey. But what I've really come up with in the book is something a little different than some of the things that are out there. First of all, I don't lay it out as an intellectual idea with footnotes and all the rest. It's a series of stories, really. But the story that the book tells is of someone, that's me, coming to a place where I'm no longer worried about paradox and doubt. I kind of embrace them. And so I have a section in the book, I haven't marked this, but it kind of says it for me. And that is that, belief and unbelief coexist together in a way. And the way I put it is, maybe we need a new category other than theism, atheism, or agnosticism that takes paradox and unknowing into account. I believe that life evolved by natural selection. I believe that evolutionary psychology explains away altruism and debunks love, and that brain chemistry undermines my illusion of free will and personhood. I also believe that the spiritual reality hovering over, in, and through me calls me to love, trust, and hear the voice of my Creator. It seems to me that there is an off-stage and an on-stage quality to my existence. I live on stage, but sense another crew working off-stage. Sometimes I hear their voices singing in a way that's as eerily beautiful as the off-stage chorus in an opera. So rather than try to decide how do we resolve doubt, how do we resolve the collision course between atheism, Christianity, or science and faith, my sense is look, the definition of life is paradox and a learning curve, so deal with it and embrace these things rather than trying to always resolve them. And I think a lot of peace comes from that. And if someone says, well, that's illogical, it's only in your own head, my answer to them is, well, what isn't?
Yeah.
Because there's no such thing as objective reality. There's just the way we process things in our minds. Neuroscience tells us that our eyes show us about 10% of the information, and our brain makes up 90% of the picture. And I think that's the same is true for intellectual and spiritual ideas. So really, rather than fight that and keep trying to say, oh, well, what does this really mean? What does the Bible say? I think it's better to deal with the fact that this stuff is subjective, and that's how it is.
Yeah, yeah. What you just said about the Bible, and what you said right before that about that what we have in our brain is only like a small percentage of what's actually there, and our brain fills in all the gaps based on what we've experienced about that thing. There was a book I read a couple of months ago that really caught my imagination called "The Singularity is Near." And he talked about that concept of how we sort of operate on patterns,
right?
And that's the way I've come to see the Bible as well. That there's these patterns, and there are these archetypal stories that have been passed down for thousands of years. That and some people find it difficult to swallow the idea that the Bible borrowed. It didn't really borrow,
Sure.
but just naturally evolved. Those stories came out of some of those
Right.
things that humankind has always, dreamt of, imagined, tried to use to explain, the unexplainable.
Yeah, and I think that coming from my former evangelical background as a child, we actually didn't really believe in God and Jesus. I know that sounds funny. We believed in the Bible.
Right.
Those are two different things.
Yes.
And so our evidence for God was all in this book. And if the book didn't make sense, then you basically had a choice. Call the whole thing garbage, become an atheist or at least an agnostic, or become a blinkered fundamentalist just saying, hey, I don't want to hear the questions. Let's just go to the Creation Museum for our day off here and accept whatever we're told. They weren't around when I was a kid, but you get the idea.
Yes.
But I think those are really bad alternatives. I mean, obviously, 2 points I'd make that I think I talk about in Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. One, if you take the evangelical idea at face value that Jesus Christ is God, then surely when there's a competition between what Jesus says and what the rest of the Bible says, you go with Jesus. So he says, well, the law says this, but when he questions the Torah, however, here's what I would say. Well, then, which is it? Because it can't be both in terms of, say, judging your enemies or forgiving your enemies, or casting the first stone or not casting the first stone. Or the Samaritan woman that he says to her, hey, the day's coming when it doesn't matter where you worship because you worship in spirit and truth. So geography doesn't matter. The promised land, Israel, the chosen people, who's a Samaritan, who's a Jew, who's a woman, who's a man. All these things are going to go away, he says. But of course, evangelicals have reinforced patriarchy, nationalism, American exceptionalism, USA, that's very much part of the right-wing evangelical ethos. So the first thing I'd say is that, if you want to follow Jesus, you can't necessarily follow the Bible. That's an odd way to put it for some people. The second thing is if you believe in God, you better have better reasons than what's between the sheets of this book. And instead of being all worried about the book contradicting itself as if somehow your faith is in the book, the way I talk about it in Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is that, the evidence for the goodness of God is as much in my grandchild Lucy when she throws her arms around my neck, or my little grandson Jack, as it is in any book. Right. Conversely, when I read evangelical theology about hell and judgment, I'm saying to myself, hey, listen, I'm somewhat of a schmuck. I haven't always been a good person, and yet I can't imagine a situation where I would consign one of my grandchildren to burn for eternity. So how am I ascribing such vengeful, retributive thinking to the Creator, who created love and family bonds and ties and all these things in the beginning? So I just think evangelicals have got to bite the bullet. And that is, everybody picks and chooses anyway. I don't know many evangelicals who have stoned their daughter to death for losing her virginity.
Right. Or sent their mother out to the edge of the town until she's done menstruating.
Yeah, so we're all picking and choosing.
Yeah.
Let's just be honest about it and do what you were just talking about, and that is, when it comes to the flood and all these other universal myths, they were folded into the Bible too. My conclusion is some things can be true even if they never happened, in the sense that the truth is eternal and it teaches lessons. It doesn't have anything to do with did this happen or not. I mean, hey, look, even the recorded history where we have the facts, we don't have the facts. No, it's subjective. Some people say Abraham Lincoln was gay. Some people say he wasn't. That's not the point. The point is not who was he, but what did he stand for, even if half of it is just mythological. That's still something you build a framework around. And I think the same thing goes for the Bible. Evangelicals have been so stupid because they've been idolaters of a book rather than trying to approach God and trying to follow Jesus and doing what Jesus does, which is every time he talks about the Torah, which after all was his Bible, he's actually contradicting it half the time, saying basically, to put it in modern English, I don't care what this book says. I'm telling you, be merciful. Or I don't care what this book says. Here's how I see it. So if we think Jesus is the Son of God, we ought to start acting like it. And one thing we ought to do is be as critical of our scripture as he was of his, and as critical of our religious traditions as he was of his, and deal with it and live with it and be honest about it. And that's what the book really is about.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and I talked to Phyllis Tickle on one of these Skype chats a few months ago about how it might have been different, and this is to the biblical inerrantist fundamentalist worshiper of the Bible, this is like a heretical thought to imagine that the Bible could have been totally different had the Apostle Paul, like he's writing the letters to the churches, and had he had the internet, and and his recipients had it, and could immediately respond to things that he said. How much less of an authoritarian, like Paul said this, and wow, that's got to be it, and they have nothing to say about it, and he meant this because we're reading it, and we're trying to understand what he said, so that must what we understand that he said must be what he said, and he just continue with that for years and years and years, whereas as opposed to with our immediacy of response that we had, what would happen to the idea of the canon?
Right, and I think you make a really good point, and one of the things, of course, is that we actually deform the scripture by trying to make everything fit together, because we're saying, oh well, Paul seems to contradict Jesus, or Jesus seems to be contradicting, but we've accepted this magical quality to Scripture, means that we've got to screw up even what is sensible and good and common sense, because we've got to make it fit. Yeah. So, we look at Jesus' passages on mercy, and then we try to temper them and make them less radical to make it fit, say, an Old Testament passage which says the opposite thing, rather than admitting the fact that Jesus is a very different creature than most of the Bible, or admitting the fact that there are passages in Paul that seem to say one thing and another passage says another thing. Our idea of a Bible study is to make this all fit together. And I'll give you an example from real life that I know very well. Take my dad, for instance, Francis Schaeffer. People sometimes write to me and say, what would your dad think about fill in the blank? Something someone said, or maybe something I've written. My honest answer to them is, which Francis Schaeffer are you talking about? Yeah. The firebrand fundamentalist in 1957? The hippie commune leader in 68? Who was talking to Timothy Leary and had rock stars coming to L'Abri and people were up in the woods smoking dope? Or the guy who for the last 60 years of his life got identified with people like Jerry Falwell because of the pro-life movement? Because these are all different men who believe different things, by the way, not black and white overnight changes, but a slow moderating evolution in certain directions, sometimes toward more harsh, sometimes toward more liberal, but nevertheless, it isn't one guy. So similarly, if you took all my dad's books and you said, let's try to pretend there's no evolution or growth here, and say all his discussions that were recorded too, or lectures, let's just come up with a whole other intellectual construct based on the fact we've got to reconcile this stuff. Yeah. It would be like taking all the speeches a politician makes over a lifetime and say, look, he contradicted himself, he didn't keep his promises, but we've decided this guy's God, so now we've got to come up with an entire theology to explain what on the face of it makes no sense. That would take his natural progression and it would destroy it, because now you've imposed a false paradigm over the whole thing. And that's exactly what evangelicals do with the Bible. Evangelical theology, Calvinist theology, so much of this stuff is nonsense unless you're inside, and then it makes sense. Because they're trying to bring order where there is none, and then what they do is, instead of fixing anything, they just turn it into a kind of an absolutist indoctrination that you can't question, because of course it doesn't really work. And then, and so I just think it's really a shame that evangelicals worship the Bible and not God, and try to follow the Bible instead of following Jesus, because you can't do both. Yeah. You can't do both. Yeah. So from my point of view, the Bible is a badly written biography of God and Jesus that they're kind of stuck in. But this isn't my little heresy from my head. I'm looking out at the world here that is so much more beautiful than our limited interpretation of the Bible makes it, and at the same time so much more horrible than our nice little pat answers about evil and suffering and all this, none of which actually covers what happens. So I think we've got to, as I say in Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, I think we have to go outside of that construct and really use our own brains and be honest about who we are in terms of our place in the evolutionary system and the rest of it. We're not terribly advanced or smart creatures, even those of us who are, supposedly intelligent. We're not that smart. I mean, look at the mess we make. And so, to me, it's time for a little less hubris on these things, a little more humility, and just openness to change.
I had made a note. I imported the text that you sent me in the book into my Kindle.
Right.
And so I came to a spot. You were talking about, I'll read from it here. It says, trying to nail down theological certainties is putting faith in our imagination rather than in God's. It's like me demanding an explanation from Lucy in that communion line as to how her love for me works, rather than just holding her a little closer. And then a little bit further down, he said, our best hope is not found in the correct theology, the Bible, or in any other book, but in the love we express through action rather than words. And so I made a little note. This is why I like the Kindle. I can put notes right there where I'm reacting to it. It's kind of like the midrash of the technological age, and you can make your own notes. And which is, I think that's really what the Bible should be. I mean, if we can get past the, being limited or chained to the tradition of the text, rather than what the text reflects and what it was intended to reflect. And so my note says, this truth is unintelligible to those schooled in the primacy of text. And then I mentioned the book, Orality and Literacy, which was one of my seminary books.
Right.
Describes the move from the experience of oral history in community, heard as a group, to the creation and subsequent isolation of text apart from the voice. And then it was apart from the voice, but it was still read in public. People heard books read, and then it graduated from that to reading in silence.
Right, and now you're all sitting down and studying it and arguing about it. Yeah. Imagine what the fate of Shakespeare's plays would have been had this happened to them. We don't perform them. We just study them in small groups and try to parse the details. And then in the end, it's like, but wait a minute, this was a play.
Yeah.
Where are the actors' voices? Where's the drama and the emotion? It's exactly the same thing. And study a movie script instead of watching the movie. The Bible is supposed to be a door that helps us open other things up, and to an ongoing, endless, by the way, the discussion, to which there are no conclusions, because the journey is the whole deal. And so, when you look at it that way, there's a tremendous freedom, again, in accepting these paradoxes. Here's a paradox: tremendous value placed on the Bible and the history and the tradition that it represents, and the wisdom encapsulated in it, the fact that some things that never happened are still true in a different way, all this stuff. And yet at the same time, a tremendous suspicion of what happens to people whose brains kind of snap as they become cultic idolaters of a book. How insane. I mean, literally, it's like people huddled in a dark room when the whole thing is out there. Yeah. What are we doing just sitting here studying this thing? You really get that sense. There's Orthodox Judaism and certain aspects of Islam, I think, make that same mistake. You see these guys with long beards standing there just staring into this little book. Hey, look up. Yeah. And, you're just a cultic book worshiper by rote. It doesn't even, it's not even what the book was about, no matter how you read it. Yeah. It's not the book. No book is about the book. I write books for a living, and the book is never the point. The point was not just the writer, but the reader. Right. I mean, what I do is simply communicate with readers through this means, but it's a form of back and forth communication. My book is dead unless there are readers agreeing, disagreeing, loving, hating it, discussing, trying to figure out what the guy meant. And some of them may even conclude things that are truer to what the book was about than I know, because even though I'm the writer, in a way, I'm too close to it. I'm the last guy that actually knows what this. And I think that kind of openness to the text is what real writers want. Mm-hmm. Shakespeare wouldn't be pleased if everybody was just sitting there studying his text. He wants to see his plays performed. I want to hear people argue about my book. And they don't have to agree with me.
Did you ever see a movie called The Book of Eli?
I don't think I ever did.
It was, Denzel. It surprised me because I had no idea what it was about. I just knew Denzel Washington was in it, and so
yes,
it turns out he's like protecting the Bible. And
right.
It's like a post-apocalyptic world, and he's carrying around this Bible, and then the post-apocalyptic evil leader is gathering up all the books to get rid of them, but he wants this one book because he's heard of it, because he wants to take it and use it to manipulate the people, into following him, and which was a pretty good parable about a lot of what actually has happened to the Bible.
Exactly.
In its transmission, and Phyllis talks a lot, in her talks about Constantine and how he sort of held sway over what they decided to do about the canon.
Right.
And then
Well, it's a good point.
Sure.
Hey, so look, Dale, I enjoyed this, and thanks for responding so warmly to the book. Did you have anything else? And then I gotta beat it here.
Sure. I don't think so. I was thinking that sometime I would like to devise a sometime during or maybe after your various talks and tour stuff about this book to have a Google Hangout.
I'd love it.
With you
Set it up.
And several other people, and talk to them about some of these things.
That'd be fun. So let me know where. By the way, where are you located?
I'm southeast of Nashville.
Okay, because I might come down that way, on some of my speaking. I forget what happened to it last year. They were talking about bringing me down to Vanderbilt. That didn't go anywhere, but I'm doing a bunch of other stuff. Maybe you might see you at Wild Goose Festival, or
I'll definitely be there this year again.
So we'll catch up with each other, do some stuff there. But I like the idea of a Google Hangout. So hey, thanks a lot, man.
Okay, thank you.
Talk soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.